"We need privacy, Mom. You can't stay here." Those were the words my son said to me the night I showed up at his front door with a suitcase covered in dust and rain after a tornado had torn through my neighborhood and turned my home into something that barely looked like a house anymore. I remember standing there on Daniel's porch, the wooden boards still warm from the late Oklahoma sun, holding the handle of a small navy suitcase that suddenly felt heavier than anything I had carried in my 71 years. Just 6 hours earlier I had been standing on the cracked remains of my driveway staring at what used to be the living room window of the home my husband and I built together 43 years ago. The storm's sirens had started in the afternoon, long drawn-out wails that every person living in tornado country recognizes immediately. When the sky turns that strange shade of green and the wind stops for a moment like the world itself is holding its breath, you know something bad is coming. I had gone down to the small storm shelter behind my house the way we all learned to do out here. I took my purse, a flashlight, and the old photo album I keep by the kitchen cabinet. The shelter door rattled while the wind roared like a freight train passing inches away. It lasted maybe 10 minutes. 10 minutes that felt like an hour. When I climbed back out, the world looked unfamiliar. Fences were gone. Trees lay across the road like matchsticks. And my house, my beautiful little white house with the blue shutters my husband painted himself, was no longer standing the way it had that morning. Half the roof was gone and the back wall had collapsed into the kitchen. The place where my dining table used to sit was open to the sky. I stood there for a long time just staring at it because sometimes your brain refuses to understand what your eyes are seeing. A neighbor eventually drove me to the emergency shelter set up at the local high school gymnasium. Volunteers handed out bottled water and blankets while people talked quietly about where they would stay that night. Someone asked if I had family nearby and I heard myself say yes. My son lives about 30 minutes away. Daniel had moved to a new subdivision outside Tulsa 5 years earlier after he got promoted at the logistics company he works for. I had visited a few times and remembered the houses were large and modern with wide driveways and neat lawns that looked like they belonged in a magazine. When I called him he sounded surprised but not unkind. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked. I told him about the storm and the damage and that the police had blocked off my street because of fallen power lines. There was a pause before he said, "Well, you can come by for tonight if you need to." That was enough for me. I borrowed a phone charger from one of the volunteers, called a rideshare, and packed what little I still had in that navy suitcase. The driver dropped me in front of Daniel's house just after sunset. The neighborhood looked peaceful, almost unreal compared to the chaos I had left behind. Porch lights glowed warmly and sprinklers ticked quietly across perfect green lawns. I remember thinking how strange it was that life could look so normal just a few miles away from disaster. I walked up the driveway slowly because my knees were still shaking from the long day. Through the front window I could see the living room lights on and silhouettes moving inside. I rang the doorbell and waited. A few seconds later the door opened halfway and my daughter-in-law Ashley looked out at me with a polite but tight smile. She was wearing a pale gray sweater and holding a phone in one hand like she had been in the middle of texting someone. "Margaret," she said, sounding more surprised than concerned. I tried to smile even though I could feel dust on my face and in my hair. "Hi, Ashley. The storm hit my neighborhood pretty hard," I told her. "Daniel said I could stay here tonight." She opened the door the rest of the way but didn't step forward to hug me the way she used to when Daniel first married her. Instead she glanced at the suitcase in my hand and then over her shoulder toward the hallway behind her. "Daniel," she called. A moment later my son appeared from the kitchen. He looked exactly the same as he always did, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the same navy polo shirts he seemed to own in every color. For a second, I thought he might walk over and pull me into one of those big hugs he used to give me when he was younger. But he stopped a few feet away and rubbed the back of his neck the way people do when they're uncomfortable. "Mom," he said quietly. "Yeah. Ashley told me you were here." I tried to keep my voice steady. "The tornado destroyed half the house," I explained. "The police said it's not safe to stay there tonight." Daniel looked down at the floor, then back at Ashley, and something passed between them in that silent married couple language people develop over time. Ashley folded her arms lightly across her chest. That was when Daniel said the sentence I will never forget for the rest of my life. We need privacy, Mom. You can't stay here. For a moment I honestly thought I had misunderstood him. The porch light buzzed softly above my head and somewhere down the street a dog barked. I stood there holding my suitcase, feeling the evening air cool against my skin, trying to understand how the same little boy who used to climb into my lap after thunderstorms could now look at me like a guest who had arrived without an invitation. For a few seconds I simply stood there on my son's porch, holding the handle of my suitcase and trying to decide whether I had heard him correctly. The words were simple enough, but my mind kept searching for another meaning behind them, the way you sometimes replay a sentence in your head hoping it will sound different the second time. We need privacy. You cannot stay here. The porch light hummed softly above us and a warm breeze moved through the quiet suburban street, carrying the faint smell of fresh cut grass from somewhere down the block. I looked past Daniel for a moment and noticed how bright and orderly everything inside the house looked. The kitchen lights were on, reflecting off clean white cabinets and a long island counter. There were 2 coffee mugs sitting side by side near the sink as if they had been talking there just minutes earlier before I rang the doorbell. I suddenly became aware of how dusty my shoes were, how the hem of my coat was wrinkled from sitting in the emergency shelter gymnasium for hours. I cleared my throat gently because my voice felt strange in my chest. Daniel, I said quietly, I only meant for tonight. The police told us the street is blocked until morning. I will find a hotel tomorrow once the insurance people start answering their phones again. My son shifted his weight from one foot to the other, and I noticed that he still had the same nervous habit he used to have when he was a teenager trying to explain why he came home past curfew. He glanced at Ashley again before speaking, and that silent look between them told me something I did not want to understand yet. Mom, he said, we have a lot going on right now. Ashley nodded slightly beside him, her arms still folded, her expression polite but distant in a way that made the space between us feel larger than the 3 feet of porch boards separating us. I tried to smile because sometimes dignity is the only thing a person can hold on to in an uncomfortable moment. Of course you do, I said. I know life gets busy. I took a small breath and adjusted my grip on the suitcase handle. The metal felt cold against my fingers. I thought about the shelter back at the high school gymnasium where rows of folding cots were lined up across the basketball court. People were sitting on them wrapped in donated blankets while volunteers walked around with paper cups of coffee. I could go back there, I told myself. It would not be comfortable, but it would be a place to sit down. Daniel stepped forward slightly as if he might say something else, but then he stopped. For a second the 3 of us just stood there listening to the quiet neighborhood. Somewhere far away a car door closed. A sprinkler clicked on and began its slow rotation across a nearby lawn. Ashley finally spoke again, her voice careful and measured the way people speak when they are trying to sound reasonable. There are hotels about 10 minutes from here, Margaret, she said. They are probably still open since the storm happened today. Daniel quickly added, I can text you the address if you want. I nodded slowly even though I had not taken my phone out of my purse since the ride over. That would be helpful, I said. Thank you. The strange thing about moments like that is how ordinary everything looks while your understanding of the world quietly rearranges itself. The porch light still glowed the same warm yellow color. The street still looked peaceful and calm. But somewhere inside me a small, quiet realization had already begun to settle into place. I lifted the suitcase again and stepped backward down the porch stairs. The evening air felt cooler now that the sun had disappeared completely behind the houses. Daniel stood in the doorway watching me with an expression that was difficult to read. Perhaps there was regret there. Perhaps there was only uncertainty. It is amazing how quickly a lifetime of memories can pass through your mind when a single door closes in front of you. I remembered Daniel at 6 years old building a wooden birdhouse with his father in the backyard. I remembered the time he ran into the house crying because a thunderstorm had knocked the power out and he was afraid of the dark. I remembered the way he hugged me after his college graduation, lifting me slightly off the ground because he was so proud that day. Those memories existed somewhere behind the man standing in the doorway now, but in that moment they felt like photographs from someone else's life. I reached the driveway and paused beside the car that had brought me there. The rideshare driver had already left after dropping me off, assuming I would be staying the night with family. I could still see the faint outline of Daniel and Ashley standing together under the porch light. For a moment none of us moved. Then Daniel lifted one hand in a small, uncertain wave. "Good night, Mom," he said quietly. I nodded once in return. "Good night, Daniel." I turned and began walking down the sidewalk toward the corner of the street, pulling my suitcase behind me. The small wheels rattled softly against the concrete. Above me the Oklahoma sky stretched wide and dark, scattered with stars that looked calm and distant, as if the violent storm that had passed through earlier that day belonged to another world entirely. I took out my phone and sat down on the low curb beside the road, opening the rideshare app again with steady fingers. The screen glowed blue in the darkness while I entered the nearest hotel address I could find. The estimated arrival time appeared. On the screen, 12 minutes. I placed the phone in my lap and looked down the quiet suburban street one more time. The porch light at Daniel's house was still on, but the front door had closed. Somewhere in the distance I heard the faint echo of emergency sirens still moving through the city, heading toward neighborhoods that had been hit harder than mine. I sat there listening to the night air and thinking about how strange life can be. A house can stand for 40 years and disappear in 10 minutes. And sometimes the place you believe will welcome you the most is the one that quietly asks you to keep walking. The car arrived exactly 12 minutes later, its headlights sweeping quietly across the quiet suburban street as it slowed beside the curb where I had been sitting. The driver rolled down the window slightly and confirmed my name in a calm voice, and I nodded before standing up and lifting my suitcase into the back seat. As the car pulled away from Daniel's neighborhood, I looked out the window at the rows of identical houses, each one glowing warmly with porch lights and living room lamps, the kind of peaceful evening scene that people imagine when they think about home. For a moment I wondered if anyone inside those houses had noticed the tornado sirens earlier that afternoon, or if the storm had simply passed them by the way life sometimes does, touching one street while leaving the next completely unchanged. The hotel was about 10 minutes away, just off the highway near a row of restaurants and gas stations that stayed open late for travelers. When we arrived, the parking lot was filled with cars that looked like they had been driven in a hurry. Some had blankets draped over the back seats, others had suitcases piled beside the tires as families waited outside the entrance. I paid the driver, thanked him for the ride, and wheeled my suitcase through the glass doors into a lobby that smelled faintly of coffee and cleaning supplies. Behind the front desk stood a young woman wearing a hotel name badge and a tired smile. She greeted each guest with the same patient tone as she typed information into the computer. When my turn came, I explained that my home had been damaged in the storm and asked if there were any rooms available for the night. She nodded gently, clearly having heard the same story several times already that evening. "We have a few left on the 3rd floor," she said. "Many people from the affected neighborhoods are staying here tonight." She handed me a small key card and pointed toward the elevators at the far end of the lobby. The room itself was simple but quiet, with a wide bed covered in white sheets and a window overlooking the highway lights beyond the parking lot. I set my suitcase beside the bed and sat down slowly, feeling the long day settle into my shoulders. For a while I simply listened to the soft hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of cars passing outside. It was the kind of ordinary hotel room that thousands of travelers pass through every night without thinking about it, but to me it felt like a strange in-between place, somewhere between the life I had lost that afternoon and whatever came next. I removed my coat and placed it neatly over the back of the chair by the small desk. Dust from the damaged house still clung faintly to the sleeves, a quiet reminder of how quickly the day had changed. After a few minutes I took out my phone and opened the messages Daniel had sent earlier. One contained the address of the hotel I had just checked into, followed by a short line that read, "Let me know if you get there safely." I stared at the message for a moment, unsure how to respond. Eventually I typed a simple reply telling him that I had arrived and that everything was fine. A small gray checkmark appeared beneath the message showing it had been delivered, but there was no immediate response. I set the phone down on the nightstand and leaned back against the pillows, letting my thoughts drift. Earlier that afternoon my biggest concern had been whether the tomato plants in my backyard would survive the coming windstorm. Now my home stood half collapsed beneath an open sky, and I was sitting alone in a hotel room with nothing but a small suitcase and a purse containing a few documents and family photographs. Yet strangely enough, the loss of the house itself did not hurt as sharply as the memory of standing on Daniel's porch with the door slowly closing behind him. Buildings can be repaired or replaced. Insurance companies exist for that very reason. But the quiet distance that had appeared in my son's voice felt far more difficult to understand. I closed my eyes and tried to picture the house as it had looked that morning before the storm. The blue shutters Daniel helped paint when he was 16. The wooden dining table where my husband and I celebrated anniversaries and birthdays for decades. The small hallway where Daniel used to measure his height each year against the wall as he grew taller. All of those memories were still intact somewhere, even if the walls that once held them were no longer standing. The next morning sunlight filtered softly through the hotel curtains and woke me earlier than I expected. For a moment I forgot where I was, thinking I had fallen asleep in the living room recliner back home after watching the evening news. Then the unfamiliar ceiling above me brought the memory of the storm rushing back. I sat up slowly and checked my phone. There were several messages from neighbors sharing photos of the damaged street and asking if everyone was safe. One message from the insurance company had arrived overnight acknowledging the claim I had filed online before leaving the emergency shelter. It said that an adjuster would contact me soon to discuss the damage assessment and the next steps. I read the message twice, realizing that this was the first practical step toward rebuilding whatever life came after the storm. Outside the hotel window the morning traffic had already begun to fill the highway. People were heading to work, stopping at the nearby coffee shop, continuing their normal routines as if nothing unusual had happened the day before. I dressed carefully, smoothing the wrinkles from my coat as best I could, and placed the key card on the desk before leaving the room. As the elevator carried me down toward the lobby, I felt a quiet sense of determination settle in my chest. Storms pass eventually. Roads reopen. And even when one door closes, life has a way of placing another path quietly ahead for those willing to keep walking forward. The morning air outside the hotel felt cooler than the night before, carrying the clean smell that often comes after a storm passes through the plains. I stepped out of the lobby with my purse over one shoulder and paused for a moment beside the parking lot, watching the steady movement of cars along the highway. The world had already returned to its ordinary rhythm. People were driving to work, stopping at the coffee shop across the street, talking on their phones as they hurried through the parking lot. It was a strange feeling to realize that while an entire neighborhood had been turned upside down just a few miles away, the rest of the city was already continuing as if the storm had only been a brief interruption. I walked to the small diner next to the hotel and ordered a cup of coffee and a simple breakfast. The waitress greeted me kindly and mentioned that many people from the damaged neighborhoods had come in earlier that morning looking for a warm meal and a place to sit for a while. I thanked her and chose a booth near the window where I could watch the traffic moving past outside. As I stirred the sugar slowly into my coffee, I took out my phone again and looked at the message from the insurance company. The claim number was listed clearly in the email along with the name of the adjuster who would be contacting me later that day. I had dealt with insurance paperwork once before many years ago after a heavy hailstorm damaged the roof of the house, and I remembered how slow and complicated the process could be. Still, there was a certain comfort in knowing that the system existed for situations exactly like this. Homes can be repaired. Walls can be rebuilt. Even memories that seem tied to a place often find ways to live somewhere else over time. What lingered in my thoughts more strongly that morning was the quiet moment on Daniel's porch when he had stepped back and allowed the door to close. I tried to replay the conversation in my mind, searching for some misunderstanding or hidden explanation that might make the situation easier to accept. Perhaps Ashley had been worried about space in the house. Perhaps Daniel had simply panicked and chosen the easiest response without thinking about what it meant. People make poor decisions sometimes when they feel pressure from the life they have built around themselves. The waitress returned with my breakfast and asked gently if everything was all right. I assured her that it was and thanked her again before beginning to eat. The warm food helped clear my head a little, and for the first time since the storm I felt something close to calm settle over me. I finished my coffee and stepped back outside just as my phone vibrated in my hand. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but the area code matched the city. When I answered, a friendly voice introduced himself as Mark Henderson from the insurance company. He explained that he had been assigned to my claim and wanted to arrange a time to inspect the property. I told him about the blocked road and the police barricades, and he assured me that those situations were common after severe storms. He said that once access was restored he would visit the site and begin documenting the damage. Then he mentioned something that caught my attention. According to the preliminary information in my policy file, he said, my homeowner's insurance included full replacement coverage for the structure and the major contents of the house. He spoke in the calm, professional tone of someone explaining ordinary business details, but the words carried a quiet significance. Full replacement coverage meant that the value of the house itself would not be based on its age but on the cost required to rebuild it entirely. I thanked him for the information and ended the call with a promise to stay in contact as the process moved forward. When I lowered the phone, I realized that for the first time since the storm began I was thinking not about what had been lost but about what might still be possible. After leaving the diner I drove back toward my neighborhood to see whether the police had reopened the street. The closer I came to the area, the more visible the signs of the storm became again. Fallen branches lined the sidewalks and several utility trucks were parked along the main road where workers were repairing damaged power lines. When I reached the corner near my house, an officer directed me slowly through the barricade and explained that residents could now return briefly to gather belongings if the structures were safe enough to enter. I thanked him and continued driving until the familiar outline of my street appeared ahead. The sight of the damaged houses was sobering, but it was not as overwhelming as it had been the evening before. In daylight the destruction looked less like chaos and more like a difficult project waiting to be repaired piece by piece. When I parked near my driveway and stepped out of the car, I stood for a moment looking at what remained of the house. The blue shutters were still attached to the front window, and the porch steps where Daniel had once sat as a child eating popsicles on summer afternoons were still intact. I walked carefully across the yard and retrieved a few personal items that had been scattered near the collapsed kitchen wall, placing them gently into a cardboard box I found inside the garage. As I worked quietly among the broken boards and fallen insulation, I thought again about the message from the insurance company and the calm voice of the adjuster explaining the coverage details. Life had changed overnight, but it had not ended. And sometimes the future begins not with a dramatic moment but with the quiet realization that you still have the strength to begin again. The afternoon sun had begun to lower slightly by the time I finished gathering the few belongings I could safely retrieve from the damaged house. The cardboard box in my hands was not heavy, but it contained things that mattered to me far more than their weight suggested. Inside were the photo album I had carried into the storm shelter, a small wooden clock that used to sit on the kitchen wall, and a framed picture of Daniel at 8 years old holding the first fish he had ever caught during a family trip to Lake Eufaula. I placed the box carefully in the trunk of my car and stood for a moment looking at the house again. Without the roof above the kitchen and the back wall partially collapsed, the inside of the house was open to the sky. Sunlight fell across the old dining table that somehow remained standing in the middle of the room as if it had decided to stay even after everything else had given way. I walked slowly back to the car and closed the trunk, brushing the dust from my hands. A few neighbors were doing the same thing along the street, quietly sorting through what remained of their own homes. Some spoke in low voices with insurance adjusters who had begun arriving in white trucks, while others simply stood looking at the damage as if trying to understand where to begin. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine, letting the quiet settle around me. Earlier that morning the insurance adjuster had explained that the next step would involve a detailed inspection and a formal report. Once the damage was documented, the company would begin processing the financial portion of the claim. At the time it had sounded like a long and complicated process, but now, sitting there with the afternoon light stretching across the broken roofline of the house, I realized something important. The storm had taken away the building itself, but it had not taken away the possibility of rebuilding. I drove back toward the hotel slowly, passing several utility trucks and volunteers who were distributing bottled water and supplies to residents along the main road. When I reached the hotel parking lot, the same cluster of cars was still there, though the atmosphere felt slightly calmer than it had the night before. People were moving in and out of the lobby carrying coffee cups and small bags from nearby stores, talking about insurance calls and repair crews instead of the storm itself. Inside the hotel lobby, I stopped by the front desk to extend my stay for another night. The young woman behind the counter recognized me and smiled kindly as she updated the reservation in the computer. She told me that many of the guests had also decided to remain for a few extra days while they arranged temporary housing or waited for updates from their insurance companies. After thanking her, I returned to my room and placed the cardboard box on the small desk beside the window. I opened it slowly and lifted the photograph of Daniel holding the fish. He was smiling widely in the picture, standing beside his father on the wooden dock with the lake stretching bright and blue behind them. For a moment I allowed myself to remember that day in full detail. Daniel had been so excited that morning he woke up before sunrise and insisted on helping his father prepare the fishing gear. I could still hear the laughter when the fish tugged on the line and he nearly lost his balance trying to reel it in. That little boy had been full of warmth and enthusiasm, the kind of child who ran back into the house after school to tell his mother every detail about his day. As I set the photograph gently back into the box, I realized that time changes people in ways that are not always easy to see while it is happening. Careers grow, families expand, responsibilities shift. Sometimes the small space that once existed for parents slowly becomes crowded with other priorities. Later that evening my phone vibrated again on the nightstand. When I picked it up I saw Daniel's name on the screen. For a moment I considered letting the call go to voicemail, but instead I answered with the same calm voice I had used all day. Daniel asked how I was doing and whether the house looked very bad in daylight. I explained what I had seen and mentioned that the insurance company had already begun the claim process. There was a pause on the other end of the line before he responded. "That is good," he said. "Maybe things will work out faster than expected." His tone sounded thoughtful, almost cautious, as if he were trying to understand the situation more clearly than he had the night before. I thanked him for checking in and assured him that I was managing everything step by step. The conversation lasted only a few minutes before we said goodnight. When I placed the phone back on the nightstand, the room was quiet again except for the steady hum of the air conditioner. I walked to the window and looked out across the highway, lights glowing in the distance. The storm that had shaken the entire region only a day earlier had already become a story people were discussing on the evening news rather than something still unfolding. Yet for me the experience had opened a different kind of understanding. Sometimes a storm does more than damage buildings. Sometimes it reveals which doors remain open and which ones quietly close when life becomes inconvenient. As I stood there watching the traffic move steadily through the night, I felt something settle gently into place inside my thoughts. The future ahead of me might look different from the life I had known before, but it was still mine to rebuild in whatever way I chose. The next morning began quietly, the kind of calm morning that feels almost too gentle after a storm has torn through an entire region. I woke early in the hotel room and sat for a moment at the edge of the bed, listening to the distant sound of traffic outside the window. For the first time since the tornado, my thoughts felt organized rather than scattered. The previous day had been filled with phone calls, insurance paperwork, and the careful work of retrieving what remained of my belongings from the damaged house. Now the situation had moved into a different stage, one that required patience rather than urgency. I made a cup of coffee using the small machine in the corner of the room and sat beside the window where the morning sunlight was beginning to stretch across the highway. While I drank the coffee slowly, my phone buzzed with a new message. It was from the insurance adjuster, Mark Henderson, confirming that he would be visiting the property later that afternoon to begin the formal evaluation. He explained that the process involved documenting the structure, estimating the cost of repairs or reconstruction, and reviewing the details of the replacement coverage included in my policy. The message was written in the clear and careful language that professionals use when they want to make sure nothing is misunderstood. I replied with a simple confirmation and told him that I would meet him at the property once he arrived. After getting dressed, I packed the cardboard box containing my photographs and small keepsakes into the trunk of the car again and drove back toward my neighborhood. The sky was bright and blue, almost as if the storm had never happened, but the streets closer to my house still carried the quiet evidence of what the wind had done. Several roofs were covered with temporary tarps and tree branches had been stacked neatly along the sidewalks where volunteers were preparing to remove them. When I arrived at the house, Mark Henderson's truck was already parked beside the curb. He greeted me with a friendly handshake and introduced himself as a man who had spent more than 15 years inspecting properties after storms across the region. His calm presence immediately made the situation feel more manageable. Together we walked slowly around the property while he took photographs and notes on a digital tablet. He explained what each step of the inspection meant and how the insurance company calculated the value of rebuilding a home from the ground up. As we stood near the damaged kitchen wall, he pointed toward the roof structure and mentioned that the level of destruction suggested a full replacement would likely be necessary rather than a simple repair. Hearing those words might have frightened me the day before, but now they carried a different meaning. A full replacement meant that the future of the house was not limited by its past condition. When the inspection ended, he summarized the information he had gathered and explained that the final report would be submitted to the company within a few days. Based on the coverage in my policy, he said, the financial settlement would likely be enough to rebuild the structure and replace a large portion of the interior contents. He spoke with the confidence of someone who had seen many families recover from storms like this one. After he left, I stood quietly in the yard for a moment looking at the place where the house had stood for more than 4 decades. The broken boards and scattered insulation no longer looked like the end of something. Instead, they looked like the beginning of a long but possible process of rebuilding. As I drove away from the neighborhood later that afternoon, my phone rang again. This time it was Daniel. His voice sounded more relaxed than it had during our brief conversation the night before. He asked how the inspection had gone and whether the insurance company had given any indication of what might happen next. I told him about the adjuster's visit and the possibility that the house would be completely rebuilt. There was a short pause before he responded with quiet surprise. That sounds like a lot of coverage, Mom. I explained that my husband had insisted on purchasing the full replacement policy many years earlier because he believed it was the safest option for a home that had been in our family for so long. Daniel listened carefully while I described the inspection and the next steps that would follow. When I finished speaking, he cleared his throat and said that he and Ashley had been thinking about the situation and that if I needed a place to stay while the rebuilding process moved forward, they could try to make room at their house after all. His words were polite, but the timing carried its own meaning. I thanked him calmly and told him that I had already arranged to stay at the hotel for the time being while I reviewed my options. The conversation ended with a promise to speak again soon, but after I placed the phone back on the seat beside me, I felt an unexpected sense of clarity. Sometimes people reveal their true priorities not through what they say first, but through what they say after circumstances begin to change. As the highway stretched ahead beneath the afternoon sun, I realized that the storm had taken away my house but had also given me something else in return. It had shown me exactly where I stood in the lives of the people around me, and that knowledge carried a quiet strength that I had not fully understood before. The days that followed moved slowly but steadily, like the careful work of rebuilding a structure one board at a time. Each morning I woke in the hotel room with a clearer understanding of what needed to be done. Phone calls with the insurance company turned into scheduled meetings, paperwork became organized in a folder on the small desk beside the window, and the adjuster's report arrived exactly 3 days after the inspection, just as Mark Henderson had promised. I sat at the desk reading the document line by line while the afternoon sunlight stretched across the room. The report confirmed what he had explained during the inspection. The house would be classified as a total structural loss due to storm damage, and the replacement coverage included in the policy meant that the insurance company would provide the financial settlement required to rebuild the entire structure from the ground up according to modern construction standards. The numbers listed on the final page were larger than anything I had ever managed personally in my life. For a long moment I simply sat there looking at them, remembering the day my husband insisted we upgrade the policy many years earlier, even though it meant paying a little more each year. He had always believed that preparation was a quiet form of protection for the future. I closed the folder carefully and leaned back in the chair, feeling a mixture of gratitude and responsibility settle over me. Rebuilding the house would take time, but the path forward was now clear. Later that afternoon my phone rang again, and once more Daniel's name appeared on the screen. His voice sounded different from our previous conversations, warmer and more attentive, as if he had been thinking carefully about what to say before calling. He asked whether the insurance company had finished the evaluation, and I told him about the report and the settlement that would allow the house to be rebuilt. There was a brief silence on the line before he responded with surprise that he tried to disguise as casual interest. That is really good news, Mom," he said slowly. "Rebuilding might actually give you a better place than before." I agreed that it would certainly be an opportunity to start fresh, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Then Daniel mentioned that he and Ashley had been talking about the situation again and that they felt bad about how quickly everything had happened the night I arrived at their house. He explained that the storm had caught everyone off guard and that they had not known how to handle the sudden change. He said that if I still needed somewhere to stay while the construction process moved forward, their guest room would be available. I listened quietly while he spoke, remembering the image of the front door closing slowly under the warm porch light only a few nights earlier. His words now were polite and carefully chosen, but the difference between that evening and this phone call was impossible to ignore. I thanked him sincerely for the offer and told him that I appreciated the thought behind it. Then I explained that for the moment I preferred to remain at the hotel while I reviewed plans for the rebuilding project and met with contractors recommended by the insurance company. Daniel accepted my answer with a thoughtful pause, and before ending the call he said that he hoped everything would work out well for me. When the conversation ended, I set the phone down on the desk and looked again at the folder containing the insurance report. Outside the window the evening sky was turning soft shades of orange and purple above the highway lights. Cars continued moving steadily along the road, each driver heading somewhere important in their own life. In that quiet moment I understood that the storm had changed more than the structure of my house. It had quietly revealed the true shape of the relationships around me. Some people had shown kindness without hesitation, like the hotel clerk who greeted every displaced neighbor with patience or the insurance adjuster who explained each step of the process with calm reassurance. Others had responded only after circumstances began to shift in a more comfortable direction. Neither response was dramatic or loud, but both carried a clear meaning. The following morning I met with a local contractor recommended by the insurance company who specialized in rebuilding homes after severe weather damage. He brought architectural sketches and examples of modern designs that could replace the original structure while keeping the familiar character of the neighborhood. As he described the possibilities, I found myself imagining the future house in a way that felt both new and respectful of the past. The kitchen could be brighter with larger windows facing the backyard. The living room might open into a small reading space where the old wooden clock could hang again on the wall. These were simple ideas, but they reminded me that rebuilding was not only about restoring what had been lost. It was also about shaping what came next. That evening I returned to the hotel room feeling a quiet sense of direction that had not existed a week earlier. The storm had taken away the place where I had lived for most of my adult life, but it had also cleared the path for something different to rise in its place. And as I stood by the window watching the steady flow of headlights along the highway, I realized that the most valuable part of the future ahead of me was not the new walls or the modern roof that would soon replace the old house. It was the calm understanding that I could rebuild my life according to my own choices, guided not by the expectations of others but by the quiet strength that storms sometimes reveal. The following week unfolded with a quiet rhythm that slowly replaced the chaos of the storm. Each morning I woke in the hotel room with a growing sense that my life had moved into a new chapter, one that was less about loss and more about decisions. The contractor I had met earlier returned with more detailed plans for rebuilding the house, and together we reviewed sketches spread across the small table in the hotel lobby. He explained how the foundation could remain in place while the structure above it would be rebuilt with stronger materials designed to withstand future storms. The new design included larger windows, reinforced roofing, and a slightly expanded living area that opened toward the backyard where my husband once planted rows of tomato vines every summer. As he spoke I could almost picture the new house standing there, bright and welcoming again, not as a replacement for the past but as a continuation of the life that had grown around that piece of land for decades. I signed the first set of construction agreements later that afternoon, and when the contractor shook my hand he smiled and said that rebuilding often gave people the chance to shape their homes in ways they had never imagined before. When I returned to the hotel room that evening the folder of documents felt heavier with responsibility but also lighter with possibility. A few hours later my phone rang once again and Daniel's name appeared on the screen. This time his voice carried an eager tone that had not been present during our earlier conversations. He asked how the rebuilding plans were progressing and whether the insurance company had confirmed the financial settlement. I explained that the construction process would begin soon and that the coverage provided by the policy would allow the entire structure to be rebuilt with modern materials and updated design features. There was a pause on the line followed by a soft whistle of surprise. "That must be quite a large settlement, Mom," he said carefully. I could almost imagine him sitting at his kitchen table while Ashley listened nearby. I answered calmly that the policy had been designed many years ago specifically to protect the house if something like this ever happened. Daniel then mentioned that he and Ashley had been thinking more seriously about the situation and that they wanted to help however they could. He suggested that perhaps during the rebuilding process I might consider staying with them for a while so that I would not have to remain in the hotel alone. His words sounded generous, but the shift in tone was impossible to overlook. I remembered the porch light on the night of the storm, the quiet moment when the door closed and I stood outside with my suitcase. I thanked him sincerely for the offer and told him that I appreciated his concern. Then I explained that I had already arranged temporary housing through the insurance policy, which included accommodations during the rebuilding period. The hotel stay would be covered, and once construction began the company would assist with longer-term arrangements if necessary. Daniel listened quietly and responded with a thoughtful pause before saying that he was glad everything was working out smoothly. When the call ended, I placed the phone on the table and sat back in the chair for a moment, reflecting on how quickly circumstances can change the way people see a situation. A week earlier I had been a mother seeking shelter after losing her home in a storm. Now I was a homeowner preparing to rebuild with the support of an insurance policy that my husband had insisted upon years before. Neither version of the story was incorrect, yet the difference in how others responded to them was impossible to ignore. The following day I drove back to the property once more where construction markers had already been placed around the foundation to guide the rebuilding crew. Standing there beneath the wide Oklahoma sky, I felt a quiet sense of ownership not only over the land but over the decisions that would shape the future of the house. I walked slowly along the edge of the yard where the old oak tree still stood untouched by the storm. Beneath its branches Daniel had once built a small wooden swing when he was a teenager, proudly showing me how he had tied the rope securely around the thick limb. The swing itself had been lost years ago to weather and time, but the memory remained clear. I realized then that rebuilding the house did not require rebuilding every expectation tied to the past. Some relationships change as life moves forward, and sometimes those changes reveal truths that are easier to understand with distance. That evening when I returned to the hotel, the sky was glowing with the soft colors of sunset across the highway. Cars moved steadily through the fading light while travelers checked into the same lobby where I had arrived only days earlier carrying a dusty suitcase and a quiet uncertainty about where I belonged. Now the uncertainty had faded. The storm had taken away the old structure of my home, but it had also given me the freedom to rebuild not only the house but the boundaries around my life. And as I watched the final sunlight disappear beyond the horizon, I understood that the future ahead of me would be shaped not by the door that once closed behind my son but by the many doors that I now had the strength to open on my own. Construction began 3 weeks after the storm, and the first morning the crew arrived I stood across the street watching the trucks pull into the driveway that had once led to the front door of the house my husband and I built together more than 40 years earlier. The sound of engines and the steady movement of workers unloading equipment carried a quiet sense of purpose that felt very different from the silence that had followed the tornado. Where broken boards and scattered insulation had once covered the yard, there were now stacks of fresh lumber and carefully marked measurements guiding the outline of the new structure. The contractor walked over to greet me with a confident smile and explained that the foundation had passed inspection and that the rebuilding process would move quickly now that materials had arrived. As he spoke, I looked across the property and imagined the new walls rising where the old ones had once stood, stronger and brighter than before. Over the following weeks I visited the construction site often, sometimes bringing coffee for the crew in the early mornings and other times simply standing quietly beside the old oak tree while the frame of the new house slowly took shape. The hotel room that had felt temporary during those first uncertain nights became less like a shelter and more like a waiting room between the past and the future. During that time Daniel called several times, each conversation polite and thoughtful, yet always carrying a certain hesitation that had not existed when he was younger. He asked about the progress of the construction and occasionally suggested stopping by the site to see the work himself. I welcomed the idea and told him that he was free to visit whenever he wished. One Saturday afternoon he and Ashley arrived together while the crew was installing the roof beams. They stepped carefully across the yard, looking around with expressions that mixed curiosity with surprise at how quickly the structure had grown. Daniel walked beside me along the edge of the foundation while Ashley studied the architectural plans posted near the contractor's truck. "It looks bigger than the old house," Daniel said quietly as he examined the layout. I explained that the new design included larger windows and reinforced materials that would better withstand future storms. He nodded thoughtfully, and for a moment we both stood there watching the workers lift the long wooden beams into place against the bright blue Oklahoma sky. After a few minutes Ashley approached and asked how the insurance process had worked so smoothly. Her voice sounded friendly but carried the careful tone of someone trying to understand details that had once seemed unimportant. I explained that my husband had always believed in preparing for the unexpected and that he had upgraded the homeowner's policy many years earlier to include full replacement coverage. Ashley nodded slowly while Daniel looked toward the rising frame of the house with a thoughtful expression. Before they left that afternoon Daniel placed a hand on my shoulder and said he was glad that everything had worked out after the storm. His voice carried a mixture of pride and reflection that reminded me briefly of the young man he had once been. Months passed and the house continued to grow board by board until the day finally arrived when the contractor handed me the keys to the front door of the completed structure. The new house stood on the same piece of land but felt brighter and stronger, with wide windows that allowed sunlight to fill the living room and a kitchen that opened toward the backyard where the oak tree still stretched its branches across the grass. I walked slowly through each room, touching the smooth walls and polished counters while the quiet hum of the new appliances filled the air. Later that afternoon Daniel and Ashley came to visit again, stepping through the doorway with genuine admiration for how the place had turned out. The living room looked larger than before, and the kitchen carried the warm scent of fresh wood and paint that still lingered in the air. Daniel looked around carefully before turning toward me with a thoughtful smile. "You rebuilt everything, Mom," he said. I answered gently that storms sometimes take away what we have known for many years, but they also give us the chance to rebuild with clearer understanding. Ashley stood near the window looking out toward the backyard where the oak tree cast a wide shadow across the grass. The moment was quiet and respectful, filled with the kind of calm that comes after a long journey through uncertainty. As evening approached and they prepared to leave, Daniel paused beside the front door and looked back into the living room where the sunlight was fading into soft gold across the floor. "I am glad you stayed strong through all of this," he said quietly. I thanked him and walked with them to the driveway where their car was waiting. When they drove away I remained standing there for a moment beneath the wide Oklahoma sky, listening to the gentle movement of wind through the branches of the old oak tree. The storm that had once reduced my house to broken boards had also revealed something deeper about the way life unfolds. Doors sometimes close when we expect them to open, and storms sometimes remove the structures we believed would always remain. But the strength to rebuild does not come from the walls of a house or the approval of others. It comes from the quiet decision to stand again on the same ground and build something stronger with the wisdom that time and experience have given.